Song of the Tree. Try to remember that a living tree is only half of the story. The other half is under the ground. Try to imagine that the roots reach wide as a house and deep as a well. Every human animal has the silhouette of a tree burned somewhere inside. Close your eyes and see it. Mine is a great big beech tree shaped like somebody dropped a grenade at its middle and the little tree grew up around the center, a hand with 6 fingers. I am partial to primitive style renderings of family trees. I'll offer here for you the inosculated family tree of the Knoxes of Mosestown. Short roots, grafted trunk, and gemmel branches. These are the people who live inside my songs. They are one of my families, and I belong to them. Trees rub against one another in the wind until the outer bark is gone, at which point they rub each other's inner parts until they grow one into the other, until they are singular. Aunt Jane's husband Homer was a McDowell County woodhick. He was from Switchback, an axeman and boom poke who walked across floating logs just as easy as an afternoon stroll. He said that if you had to take down trees for your bread, you'd better plant as many as you drop. I don't think that notion caught on with his contemporaries. Homer died when I was 5, on a Sunday, on the water. He was in the log dump. His caulk boot caught a knot and he was yanked down in a hard roll, knocked unconscious when his head smacked the timber. He slid limp into a black gap of water that clacked shut just as dull and quick as it had opened. Homer was too soft for the life of a knot bumper. Trees will always make widows. Close your eyes, knot bumper, and know the layer you take. That was the last thing Magnolia said. I can see her still, clear as a picture hung on the wall, standing in black of night next to the head-high fire, creek beyond catching light from the moon, everybody wild drunk on hooch. She screamed it at him, the white man who'd told her he loved her. He'd been in the bottle for 4 days. He was so tall next to her, shirtless and slicked with sweat, mumbling about taking down every tree for 100 miles. His forearms were thick. His fingers curled like talons. The whites of his eyes weren't white at all. Magnolia could hardly stand. She was slight of build and had slugged 5 times or more from the long brown bottle. She'd not said a word for an hour when all at once, in clear English, she pointed her finger up at his face and screamed it, "Close your eyes, knot bumper, and know the layer you take." He killed her. The moment she spoke it on the air, he grabbed her by the hair with his left hand, knocked her out cold with his right, and threw her in the fire like a rag doll. I couldn't get her out. I ran up on the pit, but he caught me by the coat and kept me back. Oh, how I screamed, enough to ring my own ears. He tried to kill me next, but he couldn't. He put me on the ground hard and sat on my chest and choked my throat with all that he had, and still I lived. He bore down harder. The backs of my pupils detonated 1,000 radiant moons and filled my skull with pinholes of light, but still I lived. Bolts of fire issued from my limbs, and I saw an endless helix of dark, darting strokes, but the light came back, and with it, this world. That's the night I understood I couldn't die an earthly death. He understood it too, and the fear it put in his eyes was the most powerful kind of fear you're liable to ever see. His hands gave out, and he backed away quick. I ran into the woods, and I hid. I cried and cried. Since that night, whether dark early morning or daylight nap, I have had 99 recurring dreams, cycled like clockwork beneath my time, only the faces and voices changing as the faces and voices of my waking life change. I began logging the dreams a couple of years in, numbering them in a thread-bound book of rag paper, and when that was filled, straw paper, and after that, wood pulp, and later on, store-bought paper, staple-bound. Somewhere close by, in every last one of those dreams, were always that man's choking hands. His initials were carved on tree trunks and branded on butt cuts all across the colony in the old, old days. I can see those initials still, scar on the rind, burn at the middle, S.W. After he killed Magnolia, 7 months passed, and then, on a Monday morning in May, before the sun came up, I took 5 apples from my sack and fed the 5 tied horses I'd tracked. We were inside a circle of red spruce. I left them each a fistful of sugar cubes and whispered, shh, shh, shh. I crawled from the circle and crouched next to S.W., where he slept on the ground. 4 men I'd never seen slept alongside him, corn liquor heavy on the air, no wind. The smoke from the pit was weak and thin. I straddled the saddlebag he'd fashioned as a pillow. I took out a once-used straight blade for which I'd traded the barber a stag-handled hunting knife, and on that early May morning I pulled the straight blade under the sleeping man's jaw and left a note pinned to his breast pocket that read, I am ready for all of you men, have always been ready, and if you harm my sisters, so I harm you, and if you take their life, so I will take yours. I have found this method to be very effective over the years in sending a clear message. I am a tree, and so are you.
You're listening to Books on the Bed, where I travel through the country asking our hosts, if I came to your town and stayed at your house, what books would you put on my bed? Each host will share 6 books for me to carry with me on the journey of my life. And I'm here to share those books with you. As we go, we're building a digital library with every book put on every bed across the country. And who knows, maybe someday, the world. We're trying to share as many diverse stories as possible to part a curtain between us and bring us closer to each other. We hope these books and conversations make a meaningful difference in your life. Thank you for listening and being with us on this journey.
Just remembered this. Not a book, but still might come up.
Everything is fair game.
Okay.
I live by James McBride's theory that everything got everything to do with everything.
Oh, that is great.
You know, his brain and mind work the same way.
Yeah.
Which is why I love his writing so much.
I've met him a couple times.
I got to interview him 2 years ago at the Mississippi Book Festival.
Oh, wow.
I've guest hosted their podcast the last couple of years. And my friend who runs the Book Fest, I interviewed her for my first podcast, years ago. And she and I just hit it off. And she knew I loved James so much. Mm-hmm. I literally have a painting of a good Lord bird.
Oh, wow.
In my room.
That the same that's on the cover?
No. I actually picked like a real picture of one. Oh, okay. And had my friend who's an artist in Franklin paint it. So he was coming for the Book Fest anyway in Mississippi. And we were putting together the roster of people that I was going to interview. And I had no idea that she was going to ask him. And definitely not that he'd say yes. And he did. Wow, and so that was, cool. I actually brought the painting and showed him. It was one of the best days of my life.
I bet. An incredibly multi-talented individual. I cannot believe the way he can blow that horn. I mean, I saw his band play.
Yeah, right.
Jesus, man.
I think that's
anything this guy can't do.
Yeah.
And the next time I met him was there at that Festival America, which is in Paris. And I got to be on the stage with him. There were 4 of us.
Stop.
Myself, James McBride, Tom Cooper. I can't remember the 4th guy. And we all had, translators, so it was great because I don't speak French, so you could say a sentence, your translator would say it, and you could think about what you're going to say next. Yeah. And so there I was doing that, feeling really good about myself. And then the next question went to him, and he just started speaking French.
Are you kidding me?
He didn't even use his translator. He's like, I'll be more comfortable and he just starts speaking French. I'm like, Jesus, man, this guy is...
I actually didn't know he spoke French. But it really does feel like there's nothing this guy can't do.
It does.
And I always appreciated how singular he feels as a story writer because he's just never tried to be a writer. He doesn't even identify as that.
Yeah.
And I think that's why his books are so special and it feels like unlike anything else. But I'm not going to lie. When I was reading your books, I was like, you got some James with your words.
Wow.
I think that's what made them really exciting is it gave me a very familiar feeling to reading, like, especially Cinderbottom, Deacon King Kong.
Oh,
like
yeah.
I was sitting here, I was like, yo, Glenn Taylor's like got it going on, man. Like this, it gave me that sort of thrill. And I was just thinking like, wow, yeah, you two would make sense on a stage together.
Yeah, it was so great to be with. And it was his birthday, and September 11th is his birthday. Boy, that's when we were there, and it was 2016.
Yeah.
So it was wacky, because, he was born in New York City on September 11th, and they were making something there out of, like, the 15-year anniversary, and it was kind of a wacky environment. A lot of guys in berets with machine guns everywhere, you know, because
Wow.
they had an attack at Notre Dame, and then of course it wasn't too long after Nice, you know, the attack in Nice as well. So it was a wacky festival, but the highlight was meeting him again. You know?
That's so cool. Yeah.
But anyway,
that makes
we
too much
digress.
sense. Yeah. Hey, I'm all about digressions. Well, anyway, I was going to say, you know, speaking of James, and, you know, the reason it was so cool to meet him is just, I mean, his books have been such a gift to me. And honestly, when Ann told me about you and Jesse Van Eerden, I was like, all right, I'm diving right in.
Oh, that's
and
cool.
I read all of your books right after that. And truly what a blessing they've been.
Thank you so much.
The last
Wow.
year. Like, I sell them as much as I can. You know, I've texted so many of my friends. I'm actually going to send 2 of your books to my brother up in Minnesota because I know he's gonna dig it.
Awesome. Thank you.
And so to thank you for writing these books and making our lives better through your stories,
My pleasure.
I have gifts for you
Oh, wow.
that you can open up now.
All right. I can open them right now?
Yeah.
Okay. No better gift than books. My dad and I give each other one each year at Christmas.
Heck yeah.
The last one he gave me was that Death in Mudlick by
Ooh.
Eric Eyre, which is about how the opioid crisis really, really affected southern West Virginia specifically.
Wow.
Oh, wow. God bless you, Otis Spunkmeyer. Wow.
Have you heard of this book?
I have heard of it, but I know nothing about it. What an incredible cover.
So this is another Mississippi Book Fest special.
Okay.
I knew that I was going to interview him last year in September. I got this book so that I could prepare, and my God, what a journey. And the reason I got you this book, there's a couple of reasons. So both you and Joseph are masters at incorporating deep cut cultural references
Oh, okay.
from a lot of diverse sources. Like, it's fun reading your books because you can relate to the lines that are dropped. And this is based in Philadelphia,
Okay.
where he's from. And so, I mean, another thing is I hadn't read much about Philadelphia. And so it
I
brought
haven't either,
me into this world that I was like, wow, how exciting to feel like I'm in a new place. And so there's the cultural references. Like, you're both basketball players from what I understand. But I just feel like you both of you have got this cool factor with your writing and not worried about convention. The one thing about this book, and I told Joseph this, is like, it was a huge risk to write. I mean, this is a crazy format. Like, it is stressful and one continuous story that just is like, I mean, it's chaotic. It feels like, but he clearly made a point. Like, this is how I want to write it.
Wow.
I'm going to do it. And I felt like you've done that in your
And this
stories.
is his first novel? Wow.
So it's so good. It's so
Oh, and
good.
it came out 2024.
Yeah.
So, okay.
So I really think you're going to
so much.
appreciate.
I can tell. It is
Yeah,
right.
I've
up
never
my
read any
alley.
book like it.
Oh, wow.
And the reference to, you know, God bless you, Mr. Rosewater, which is one of my favorite Vonnegut books.
Right.
And just the ever presence of the Otis Spunkmeyer muffin throughout is really funny. So anyway, I think you'll really enjoy that one.
The chocolate chip muffin.
Yep.
Oh, and this could be a volume of poetry here, I'm guessing.
Well, I know, especially with Lucille and Louise McNeil.
Yeah, wow, man, you really do your homework.
I wanted to give you a newer poet
Holly Hallworth.
who
Oh, I am not familiar.
is
This is
a
crazy.
good friend of City Lights. She actually she launched this book at City Lights last fall, and I just feel like, you know, not making comparisons with poets, but she's such a force with her love of the land and obviously the sky. And these are songs, you know, and I think you're going to love Holly. I really appreciate her as a poet. I found out about her through this book when she reached out to do that event. And so I know that you're a lover of poets, and
yes.
I figured I'd introduce a new name into the collection for you.
You certainly have. This is incredible, man. Thank you so much.
Heck yeah.
Can't
Thank
thank
you.
you enough.
Well, hey, I'm glad to be here. This is, my dream is to do exactly this. Talk to my favorite writers and the places
The
they
only problem
live.
is you've got me sitting here just wanting to read the book.
I know.
See you later. I'm just going to dive into this. Well, if and when you talk to both of them, please tell them that I am so happy to be connected to them now, and I will read the hell out of these. I can tell you that.
I love it. Yeah. So anyway, I just do that always because I need you all to know, like, It's truly wonderful, the words that you've put into the world, and I don't take it for granted. You know, I'm a bookseller, so I know the power words can have on people, and I hope to spread yours as much as I can.
I can tell you mean it, and likewise, I thank you for making the connections, not only between writers, but then learning about them, hand selling to people. That's the only way that it has worked and will work moving forward.
Yeah,
in my opinion,
because you can feel it, and that's why I do these in person too. I can't have the separation, you know, like I got to know where everybody's from. Like I got to be with you to really feel it. Yeah. And I just think that's what makes everything special and a real memory, you know. Like, I don't know that I would remember conversations I have on the computer because it reminds me of work. Mm-hmm. You know, when I used to be an academic advisor and like doing stuff over the computer and sitting in boring meetings, like, you know, that's no fun. This is the stuff of life, man. That's right. So it's cool to be here and wanted to give you those gifts before we get started. But,
awesome. Thank you.
You know, we're in Morgantown, and, you know, before we get to the books on the bed, it's important that people who listen that are not from here understand where you're coming from. Sure. And how that influences your stories. You know, I can think of just a dozen friends that are going to listen all over the country that have definitely not been to Matewan, West Virginia, or know nothing about McDowell County. And I listened to your StoryCorps interview with your dad.
Oh, wow.
Which was super cool. Because I like to know, you know, you're such a listener.
Yes.
You know, voices are important in your writing, and your dad's is like, I mean, you two talking was pretty satisfying. But I'm really drawn to people that honor where their family comes from through their writing. And so I hope to start with you giving people an idea of why Matewan and those southern West Virginia communities are so important for you to write about in your stories.
Sure, that is the perfect place to start, and I'm so glad you heard that StoryCorps interview. What an experience that was, going into the Airstream, you know. And meeting the young people who worked there. Toya was just so incredible. Anyway, great place to start, Matewan, and it's interesting that you started out talking about Morgantown, where we're sitting now, because as you know, where you've ended up and where you've come from, regionalism and even county to county, you know, pride is so big, even in a small state like West Virginia. So here we are in north central West Virginia. I, of course, grew up in southern West Virginia, however, a city boy in Huntington, as my dad would say. And he grew up in Matewan, as you pointed out. And I guess all those trips to Matewan when I was a kid to visit my grandparents, you'd be proud to know that my dad, this was his modus operandi. He would get out his old Sony tape recorder and try and get my grandma Lena to talk about the past. That's just very important to him. And she would, and it was wonderful. But she would always stop short when he asked about one certain thing, and that was, Lena, can you tell me about that day, May 20th, 1920, which is the day of what came to be known as the Matewan Massacre, or the shootout, when the Baldwin Felts agents came in to evict miners from their homes, striking miners from their homes, and Sid Hatfield and Mayor Testerman met them in the street. A shootout breaks out, and it ends up with, you know, a dozen or more laid out dead in the street. Well, she was probably about 13 at that time, and she saw the aftermath of that, and her uncle Reese Chambers was one of the men who shot and killed a couple of Baldwin Felts agents, and her uncle, or her cousin Ed Chambers, was then later shot and killed on the Welch County Courthouse steps alongside Sid Hatfield in broad daylight in front of their wives. Yeah, I mean, it's just, and so she never would speak about it. It was too painful, and that always intrigued me. But I was confused by it, frankly, as a kid. To me, Matewan was just this wild, free place where you could climb the hills and watch out for all the coal trains and put pennies on the track, you know, and where there were definitely great storytellers with a lot stronger accents than we had in Huntington, and moonshine, and just, you know, just a wild place. And so I was always intrigued by it, but I kind of didn't really start connecting with it until I left West Virginia. So first I went to Ohio University, and then later when I was getting my MFA at Texas State and we were living in Austin, Texas, there was so much state pride in Texas, you know, and I was like, hey, what about my, you know, and so that's when I started really getting into it, and kind of stealing his books when I went home and asking him about why my grandma Lena would never talk about the Matewan Massacre. And I just kind of became obsessed and didn't realize that all of this reading I was doing, books like The Battle of Blair Mountain, Thunder in the Mountains by Lon Savage, that was then going to lead a few years later to the writing of The Ballad of Trenchmouth Taggart, my first novel. And so it worked out well. It's a really interesting place. It's, to me, southern West Virginia, particularly, not just Mingo, but in particular McDowell County, as you talked about, is one of the most beautiful places to knock down the incessant and deep-rooted stereotypes that people have of the state. If anyone ever watched that episode in the final season of Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, you know, the opening episode that year was in McDowell County. I really loved how he treated West Virginia. You know, it was one of the few people who kind of came in open-minded and loving, with a loving attitude. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things he learned was like, oh my God, there's so many black people here, you know, because in that part of the state, that's just how it is because of the coal mines, you know. And it was also, so at one point, there were so many black folks there and so many immigrants from Germany, from Hungary, from Poland, really from everywhere. And so it was quite a diverse area, quite a, frankly, relatively speaking, a progressive area compared to its neighbor to the south in Virginia. And so I don't like to kind of romanticize West Virginia and its history, because it certainly has plenty of brutality and racism and all kinds of terrible stuff like every place else in this country. But I also want to make sure that people hear the stories of those folks from southern West Virginia that don't often get told, the ones kind of left behind and in favor of the present in West Virginia. So I appreciate you asking about it, and it is important.
Well, and that's, I think that's why I loved reading your work, is you can just tell how important it is in the story. I mean, like, when I read Hanging at Cinder Bottom and I saw the Hollow documentary link in the back, I mean, that was a great connection, because I got to interview Elaine McMillian Sheldon a few years ago. And that documentary was given to me as something to watch by a friend in Pikeville, Kentucky, another super overlooked place.
Right.
And it was, you know, another one of those watershed moments for me, like, dang, I don't know shit about, you know, West Virginia, and these places are important, you know? Right. And it's not even that, like, you are breathing life into a place. I don't love when people give that power. It's like, no, there's life already there. Yeah. You know, and you're just helping people appreciate it and see it and understand it and take it seriously, you know, and not use it as a joke or a stereotype to, you know, suit their needs in a story. Right. I mean, to have that, your story is centered on these places is so important, and it makes them seem a lot more alive to someone who's not from there. So I just appreciate that you've paid homage to these places that have shaped you in southern West Virginia. And yeah, they are overlooked. And I started going to southern West Virginia more because of all these stories that I've watched and read. And I agree. They're beautiful places. They're maligned for things that are outside of their control. And I think that's a whole different conversation about blaming people that had no other, I mean, everything was forced upon them from coal companies and energy companies and the like. But anyway, I just thought that was a good place to start, because clearly it's, you know, imprinted on your heart, those places. But, you know, speaking of also, you know, you mentioned your grandma Lena, right? Yes. Lena, we've mentioned Louise McNeil, Lucille Clifton. You're someone who likes good talkers, good writers, clearly. But the one thing that I loved about Songs of, and it's Betty Baach, right? Yes. Yeah, you read the just making sure that that I still got that right. But I loved how you said in an interview that you didn't want to hear from a man in this story. And you kind of listed out all of these women who are dead, but you could listen to talk all the time and never get bored. Right. You know, and this is a thread that has happened a lot in this podcast. You know, Rachel Beanland writing from the women's perspective of the Richmond fire of 1811, where majority of people that died were women, and no one thought to ask why. And so she told it from a perspective that was suppressed, especially at that time, you know. But, you know, you're elevating the woman's voice, and you asked your family even, like, hey, can I do this, you know? But I'm curious why in that novel, which, by the way, is just so good, why you wanted to hear from a woman instead of a man.
That's so cool of you to bring that up. it was a big realization because before the Songs of Betty Baach became the book that it ended up being, it was a slightly different book called Lay Me Down in Mosestown. And it was told it was, my fourth novel, and it was the first time I was trying to write from a first person perspective. All three of the first ones are this big, all-knowing, omniscient storyteller voice. And I was sure I wanted to change that. And so I wrote it from the point of view of a character named Remy Knox, who is still in the book, and who is very much like me about my demographic, my age. And something just didn't feel right. For the longest time, I tried to make that book work, and it didn't feel right. And then I had to really ask myself some tough questions, like, what is it that's not working? And I got down to the very basics of, well, who's telling the story? Well, is that who I want to hear from right now in this current climate that we're living in? Because I was writing that during COVID times, during the rise of this reignition of this hate and this white nationalism and Trump rising. And I was really writing from a place of fear, but at the same time, I wanted to hear from someone strong and revolutionary, and it just couldn't be. The voices that kept coming to me were my grandma Lena, as you brought up, Louise McNeil always, Lucille Clifton always, and then my Aunt Linda, and then another writer named Dot Jackson, who was actually from South Carolina.
Yeah.
Who I first met at the Southern Festival of Books in Nashville when we were both there with our first book, her only book.
That's so cool.
And I just thought, I certainly don't want to appropriate, but I want to give it a try. And so I asked my sisters, as you mentioned, I asked Anne Pancake, and I kind of got the word, well, just go for it, And I tried to really acknowledge in my acknowledgments in that book how difficult this was, and that I didn't make the decision lightly. But I had listened closely to those voices, and I thought, as you mentioned earlier, I write by ear. I hear it in my head, I put it on the paper kind of like song. And so I could hear them. And it felt a lot more natural, and it was certainly a lot more fun. And so I just let it rip, and I think it worked.
And you can tell, like, you had fun with it.
I did.
I think that's why the James McBride connection always, because I know, like, I can just imagine James writing this, like, oh yeah, like getting excited at his own scenes and the things that he hears. And you're both musically oriented, I mean, even in that. In Betty Baach, like one of those songs is the fact that like memory is song, right? Like, I mean, there's so many ways that you connect music to words in your writing. And I'm curious on that point, what do you say, that every poem is a song and every novel is just
a long song?
Yeah. But why do you believe that music has had such a strong influence in your stories? I mean, even the rhythm of them. Like, you can just tell it's not something that you like set out and structure in a way that is like super defined. It just feels very naturally rhythmic. But talk about the influence of sound in not even just Betty Baach, but all of your writing. Sure.
I think there's a couple parts to it. One is that certainly the way I found my footing as a writer was, we often talk to our students, do you write from an idea? Do you write from a line that pops in your head? Do you write from an image? And it's always fascinating to hear. Mine was always a line that unfurled. So, one day I was just at my office at Harper College, this big community college where I was teaching when we lived in Chicago. And the line came to me, the old man sewed his mouth shut with saltwater rated fishing line. And I just typed it, and I didn't know where I was going to go. And so I've evolved since then. And it's not exactly that same process, but it's still there. So The Condemned Man Wore No Shoes. It just has a certain cadence. And I feel the cadence, and I say, okay, I'll start there. Beyond that, though, it is difficult to overstate how much music is in my life and my family's life. My daughter Parsley she just always has her headphones on. Usually one ear, on and one ear off if she has to hear us. But, and I, especially during the COVID times, I was just like, I had a little Frank Ocean playlist of perfectly picked Frank Ocean songs that like mellowed me out and calmed me down. And so I use music on a daily and hourly basis to orchestrate our lives and to make us feel the way I want us to feel. I shouldn't phrase it like that. I'm not trying to control my own feelings. I'm just trying to set a tenor or a sound in our living. I started titling mixtapes this way back in the day. Orchestrating Our Lives Volume 1, Orchestrating Our Lives Volume 2.
I love that.
Because I think that it can help immensely. And so what I've realized then, because of those two things, because of hearing lines as cadence or rhythm filled, almost lyrical lines like in poetry, combined with how much music is in the air of my lived life every day, that, perhaps I should have been a musician, but I didn't have it. That wasn't the way I went. And so as much as I can, and I don't think this is possible, but as much as I can, I want my writing to be music. It's not possible, to be clear.
Oh, I get it.
But I want to come close. I want it to feel like the experience of listening to music when people read it.
And you got it. You definitely got it. As a person who's similarly structured, well, not structured, my life is soundtracks. I knew we were going to be friends when I heard you talk about that. Yeah. Even this morning, I listen to Andrea Von Kampen every time before I go do an interview, particularly with people that are in places where land and climate change and industry and all of these forces come together, because she's from Nebraska, Willa-Cather country, actually lived in the same town, was raised in the same town I lived in for a year and a half when I was a kid. That's in the middle of nowhere west of Lincoln. Oh, wow. But anyway, her music to me just sets the tone for the sharing of stories and why it's important. And I listen to her every time when I
and I
come
love
to
that
an
you
interview.
have a ritualistic routine of when you listen to it in preparation for a certain thing you're going to do. I really can relate to that.
Totally, yeah. And there are certain hip hop, Common Market, Ross Ion, the MCs from rural Kentucky, Oldham County, Kentucky, I put on Tobacco Road every time I'm driving through rural southern landscapes, because it puts me in the mood, right? And sometimes though, even in the hills, I'll listen to Master Ace and Rakim and some of the people when I need to get in a certain mood. So yeah, it's just and it all depends on what's happening that day, and even what the weather's like.
Beat.
Yeah.
I haven't thought of that in a long time.
So at any rate, I just love that. And I just think that your music being influenced by so many diverse sources of music comes out, and good talkers and good writers. It's one thing to listen to music. It's another thing that it's a part of your soul, you know, and you can tell that in your writing. And another person that I think we have to talk about, I don't know if you have one of her books, Louise McNeil. Oh my gosh. Okay. So speaking of Elaine in that interview, in the middle of it, she busted out Hill Daughter and then read a poem, because she was talking about how she's telling a story that's already been told through King Cole. And some of these people that have already told the story she didn't even know about, but then she found out about Louise McNeil. And so she read this poem, and I think it was about the New River, but she just did that out of nowhere. And I'd never heard a Louise McNeil poem before. And I was like, come again? Yeah. Oh my gosh. So I dove into that. But I think it's really important. And I would love for you to talk about why Louise McNeil is so wonderful, why you love her, because I feel like more people should read her poetry.
I do too. And I've told my students that for so long. And it's funny you brought up Elaine and Hill Daughter. Well, first of all, I don't know if Anne Pancake also brought up, I'm certain she did bring up Louise McNeil in your interview with her, but Anne has kind of pointed out to me that she sees this, Louise McNeil connection in so many writers, but in particular, she has mentioned this triangle of myself and Elaine and Anne.
Wow.
Because it just, Hill Daughter that you brought up, that's not the one I've selected over here. I have so many, from Gully Mountain all the way up. But Milkweed Ladies is what spoke to me the most. It's interesting because I always tell my students, my top three writers are Lucille Clifton, Louise McNeil, and Charles Portis. So 2 out of the 3 are poets. And then my favorite book, in a way, it's so hard to pick a favorite, but in a way, the most profoundly affecting book by each of those 2 poets was their thin memoir. So in the case of Louise McNeil, it was Milkweed Ladies. And in the case of Lucille Clifton, it was Generations.
Oh.
And so, yeah, I think Louise McNeil is a perfect place to start. And I'm
Heck
so
yeah,
glad
let's
to
do
hear
it.
you say that that Elaine busted out Hill Daughter. Because once, and I was kind of late to the game with Louise McNeil, relatively speaking. In other words, I didn't get into her until probably, I want to say around 2007, because I can remember flying around 2008-ish, 2009 for Trenchmouth, doing different events and reading Hill Daughter.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't stop dog-earing and underlining. And I thought, that, there was a novel to be written, to Elaine's point, like every 4 pages. The way that she talks about, growing up on Swago, it just... So to me, The Milkweed Ladies, which was published by University of Pittsburgh Press, a very thin memoir, it is the ultimate, both, for prose that is poetic or musical, as we've been talking about, and for what it laments that we've lost. So at the beginning, there's this passage. She's talking about where she grew up and standing in the meadow under Bridger's Mountain. Then I knew just the earth itself, the quiet measure of the seasons, the stars in the sky, the wheat field in August, golden darkness and day, rain and sunlight, the primal certainty of spring. Then we were all there together, the years not yet come on us, these 75 years of war and money and roaring turnpikes and torrents of blood.
Gosh.
So that's at the beginning. And then she ends it when she is at the Commodore Hotel in New York City in 1945, and she reads in the newspaper about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that's in the final chapter called Night at the Commodore. So it goes full circle from her childhood on the farm and the certainty of the seasons and being all there together, and this rock hold of the earth upon them. And it ends with this. Then it came to me, there above the roaring traffic and strange light of this strange city. It came to me in the old superstitions of us mountain people, like a fireball in the night, a death omen. Aunt Melindy had seen hers in the sky over Buckley Mountain the night her brother Potts had been killed at Gettysburg. Now mine over Hiroshima and over the Commodore Hotel. Only mine wasn't about Brother Potts. It was more about the human race, and more than that, about Earth itself. It was something else, something deep and earth-given that died that night at the Commodore. And I just, I can almost cry just reading it, because it foretells so much.
And I'm like, literally, I got goosebumps.
Yeah. And I don't want to keep repeating. I don't, and you just brought up, the climate crisis, and I don't know what else to do. I mean, I get involved in a bit of activism here and there, but I hope that somehow I can honor writers like Louise McNeil and Lucille Clifton in trying to fight for this peculiar hold that people have on each other and the places that they come from in the face of all the death and destruction that just keeps repeating.
To make that connection with Anne, many of the books that she chose yesterday, 2 of which were Robin Wall Kimmerer, were, to highlight the point that even as much, if not more than activism, what we need to do is radically change the way that we live with the land,
Yes.
our relationship to the land. And that comes that's a very personal thing. I mean, like the intimacy of land means that you actually have to spend time with it.
Right.
And so she picked out, I think it was the Deer Man, which is a French book about a guy that lived in the woods for 7 years.
Oh.
And basically became part of this group of deer. It was a real deep immersion, but to highlight the point that that's the only way that we're going to care about the land is if we know it well enough to understand. There was someone who is like a self-taught firefly lightning bug expert in Macon County, where I live in North Carolina. And I went on a nighttime excursion with her and a few other friends to look at these fireflies and talk about it and, see the foxfire glowing on the wood, and it was so cool to be out at night.
You saw the bioluminescence?
Oh yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it was dark out there, man. It was so dark. But the point of that excursion was, and I think she said this in a different presentation, you don't know even like what you're going to miss until you can't see it or you can't hear it.
Right.
And so like the point of being out there is like, even when it's most dark, there's so many things that are out there, and we have to see them. Mm-hmm. We have to be with them. We have to understand, or else they're gonna die. Their light's gonna dim out, right? Or the things that make noise are gonna go quiet. And so I really appreciate that about all of you in West Virginia, is I think helping us understand and improve our relationship with the land, make it closer. But I'm curious how you feel Louise even now can help us do that.
I think that Commodore Hotel scene at the end where she says that she no longer felt nor believed in the certainty of the seasons is so haunting to me because of climate change and because of what we've done to our land and our water and our air. And beyond that, for the longest time, I thought I will only use Louise McNeil as epigraphs to my novels. So the first one, I have galled the pith of a sumac limb to play a tune that my blood remembers. The second one, black ground was fenced for men to till, the dead of Galli own this hill. And then in the third one, I started adding in Lucille Clifton, or maybe it was the fourth one, I'm forgetting now, but I'll never not have both of them now. So what you were just saying, literally about fireflies in the darkness and bioluminescence, even though Lucille Clifton isn't from where I'm from, one of the books I got at that Downbound was the new biography of her, which is called Black Buffalo Woman. Because even though she wasn't from Buffalo proper, she was from the Buffalo, New York area. Mm-hmm. And then obviously spent so much time in Baltimore and many other places. And the Clifton House, of course, is in Baltimore. But I just feel that the way she speaks about the land and the trees, for instance, in a poem like The Killing of the Trees, is so similar to what you're talking about. And beyond that, the way that light and darkness constantly appear throughout her work, reminds me eerily of what you were just saying, literally about finding the light in absolute darkness, which of course we have here in Pocahontas County, where the Green Bank Telescope is. That's why that telescope is there. I think it was the second biggest one after Arecibo in Puerto Rico, which is now gone. Because and there's no cell reception there, and there's no cellular phones allowed. There's no microwaves. It's complete and utter darkness. It's the darkest spot east of the Mississippi, I believe. But this idea of still believing that there's light, even in the darkest of times, obviously the poem that comes to mind the most is The Light That Came to Lucille Clifton, which that lampshade, not to be too on the nose, but I never know what to do with hardcover jackets. And so I was like, I'll use it as a lampshade. So this one over here is from her collected poems in this corner.
Oh, I got to take a picture of these. One of the first interview on the first season is Ramika Bingham-Risher. You need to read her poetry. Okay. Especially Room Swept Home. I think I just talked about this with Anne, too. I mean, there are so many connections between all of you, but I mean, truly, our picture we took after the interview with the selfie is a picture of, magazine cover of Lucille Clifton. Oh, wow. Who's like right in between our heads, or like she's everywhere. Yeah. And it's like, look at this. Oh.
Well, I feel that she could feel place. I feel that she could commune with the dead, frankly. And I feel that with poems like The Light That Came to Lucille Clifton, and then especially in Generations with lines like this, even when this is what helps me when times get darkest. So during the COVID times, or during, kind of like the June of 2020 time, after George Floyd was murdered, after Ahmaud Arbery, after Breonna Taylor, and even here in Morgantown, people were getting in the streets, and my oldest son was out there with me, and I would go back and read from this book. I mean, I have, the collected poems now. Mm-hmm. And so that goes all the way from 1965 to 2010 when she died. But this one is the most important to me because my godmother, Martha Woodard, gave it to me in 1992 when I was 17 years old. Wow. Because Lucille Clifton was coming to Marshall University in my hometown. And she wrote one word, my godmother did. She was an English professor at Marshall, and she wrote the word listen. And so I had no idea who Lucille Clifton was. I was a 17-year-old dumbass white boy in Huntington, West Virginia. But I went to her reading. And I was blown away. And I even went up and shook her hand and looked her in the eye afterwards. I don't remember what I said. Something not very intelligent, I'm sure. But
I always black out in those moments. Like, I don't even want to remember what I said.
But I was young and didn't know much and wasn't very enlightened. But I just felt something. And then I would return to this book over the years. And what I eventually became so drawn to, besides my certain very favorite poems, like The Killing of the Trees and The Light That Came to Lucille Clifton, was the short memoir, Generations, which is at the back of Good Woman. And obviously Yeats plays a big part in this line, things fall apart, and we see that in so many things now, from Yeats on through so many, Achebe, the Roots, it's just everywhere.
Yeah.
But I have always loved this, and this is near the end of her memoir. Things don't fall apart. Things hold. Lines connect in thin ways that last, and lives become generations made out of pictures and words just kept.
Whew.
Yeah, and
She's so good.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I believe it. When I'm reading her, and usually I'm reading her when something really terrible is happening. I hate to say it. It restores my faith that maybe if we've, for instance, if her ancestors, her grandmother Caroline, who they called Callie, if these people went through the horrors of slavery in this country, and she's able to write before, she actually wrote that memoir when she was quite young.
Yeah.
Things don't fall apart, things hold, and she talks of it's called Generations. Though it's not my story, and though I grew up without any inkling or clue of that kind of horror in my ancestry, or and I grew up with the privilege of being white and the privilege of being a male in this country.
Yeah.
But when I read that, I just think that maybe it's never time to give in to hopelessness. Yeah, I had a lot of trouble not including that Studs Terkel book in my books on the bed. Hope dies last.
Dude, Studs
That's
Terkel.
what I try and remember.
I'm glad you have that facing out.
Yeah,
I mean, truly.
It reminds me.
That messaging is huge. I do the same thing with my books.
It really reminds me of, and I don't have this one facing out here. I think I had it in my office at WVU before I up and left that place. But I used to teach Hanif Abdul-Rakib's "They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us."
Yeah.
And to me, that's the same message. And I believe he got that from a sign that he saw a kid carrying at a Black Lives Matter protest. And hope dies last means that there will always be hope until you're dead, essentially, till your last breath. Just as they can't kill us until they kill us, or things don't fall apart, I have to maintain a belief that we're going to make it. If you don't, I'm not sure. I know hope is kind of a loaded word now, and it's used in kind of a ill-advised way by some people, but that hope dies last comes from, I'm going to mess up the translation, but it was from the farm workers movement, and Cesar Chavez. It was originally in Spanish. It was Esperanza muere última, or something like that. Hope dies last. And then Terkel just took it from the Spanish and translated it to the English.
Man, I am so glad you brought this conversation into the larger conversation, because I think one of the reasons I do books on the bed, and one of the reasons I do it in this way with people, is because there was a filmmaker in Minnesota that changed my life. She's a Chilean immigrant who came to rural Minnesota, mostly white town. Her name's Cecilia Cornejo, and I'll never stop talking about her. I don't care how annoyed people get. I mean, because there are just certain people that change your life. Mm-hmm. And I stopped in a town of 900 people in Minnesota one night on my way to Iowa for a totally different thing. I was just like, oh, heard this town's pretty cool, Lanesboro. Became friends with the art gallery owner downtown. It was like one of the few places that were open. I almost left, but then I walked in. Her and I started talking Big Ten football, random stuff. Michigan was playing Wisconsin. Okay, so we become friends over that 45-minute talk. Before she closes up, she's like, "Hey, come over to the theater with me." She's like, "You will love this." So I go in. There's a community screening of Cecilia's film Ways of Being Home. And it's about the relationship between Northfield, Minnesota, where she teaches at Carleton College, and a town in Mexico called Maltrata. Huge immigration directly from one town to the other.
Really?
And this is during the early Trump days. And so she wanted to tell this story of these people who weren't even able to put their faces on camera about ways of being home and what happens when you leave your land. But like that it was dangerous, so they came here, but now it's dangerous here.
Oh, yeah.
And it was like one of the most special films I've ever watched. And to see that community show up for Cecilia, and that like Cecilia, it hadn't even been released yet. It was her inviting the community to give her feedback, right? And to have this dialogue in it, almost all white town,
right,
in the middle of nowhere. But Cecilia's entire vision is sharing in community. She talks about going around with a need thermometer for her films.
Wow.
You know, she told the story of skateboard teenagers that were fighting back against city council so they can get a place to not be criminalized. You know, like all of these things just are so inspiring to me. But the one thing she said that stuck with me and why I always continue to travel to places, especially overlooked places, is that actually when you're with people, your hope continues. Like they feed into it. Because when you're in real life, there are a lot of things to be hopeful for. There are a lot of beautiful people.
Right.
There's so many resilient communities that people think are dangerous. Detroit, Jackson, Mississippi, Vicksburg, you know, like Tuskegee, Alabama. All these places I go, and every single time I leave, I feel more hopeful.
Right.
Because of what happens there. And that living on the internet is poison. And then allowing that to then dictate how you look at your small, tiny little world. Oh, wow, how convenient. Everything sucks. People are bad.
Right.
Get out in the world. And so her whole thing is like, I have to be out there. Because that's what happens, is that your hope is restored and your trust in each other. And that's how relationships are made. And it takes time, and it takes you actually being with people. And so anyway, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it's a really important point right now for people that feel defeated.
Totally. And that isolation you brought up of living on the internet, as you put it, is the opposite of that finding of community that you're actually out there doing. And then you're able to get on here and talk about it. And then the irony is people get on the internet and listen to it, but you know, that will change their minds. In fact, this is something that I'm only realizing as I just hit 50.
Wow.
And I have not been a part of the communities I've lived in enough. I have traveled a lot and made community with others through books and giving talks and readings and things like that. But I have not acted locally in the way that I should until quite recently, really. Yeah. And I feel that what you just described is only possible through getting out and having real human interaction in communities. And so, yeah, that's huge. The isolation is going to be the end of us.
Well, I think poetry calls us out into the world. Ironically, people see reading and poetry as like, you know, oh, you're just sitting in your room. Like, I mean, yeah, you might be doing that when you're reading it, but I don't know anybody that's not shaken by, you know, Lucille and Louise and so many wonderful poets to just like go out, right? Be part of things. This is what you need to do. This is love each other. That's an active thing. Don't just take this book and then that's that. So I think, you couldn't have started with two better people to say, hey, this is my call to you. Take these words and do something with it. Man.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And they're both looking so much at the past in order, you know, so if I'm trying to figure out all of this terrible stuff rising and I read Lucille Clifton's poem about Kent State, for instance, the awful realizations that she puts forth in that somehow pull me out, as you said, of the poem and allow me to see what's happening with current protests and current voices of dissent. With the Black Lives Movement, I'm able to look back and about her Black Panther poems, you know, and see what she's saying about Seal and so it's so important. And then, you know, I mentioned my top three.
Yeah, we got to do the Holy Triumvirate here.
Yeah, which is such a divergence, you know, to go from
I love it,
those
though.
two to Charles Portis. But I just, you know, my story there is, again, I've probably been a little too much in isolation. So I was actually living, gosh, I can't even remember if I was in Chicago or Austin at the time, but I just went to a bookstore and Dog of the South was facing out, and I had heard of Charles Portis, but we weren't reading him in graduate school. That's for sure.
Yeah.
You know? And so I just picked it off the shelf because I liked the font on his name there. And I read Dog of the South and I was like, wow, this guy is hilarious and irreverent and ornery and, just so genuine and so not fake. Like a lot of the stuff I was reading at the time seemed to not have that ring to it. So I felt that I had really found something. And then, of course, I read True Grit, and it just became instantly one of my favorite novels that I had ever read by far. And then I just went and started at the beginning and did Norwood, then True Grit again, then Dog of the South, and Masters of Atlantis, and then Gringos, his final one, which I if I had to pick one, I think the only reason I picked Gringos is because it's a little underappreciated, maybe. In other words, True Grit doesn't need any more love.
And I appreciate that you did that.
Truly. It is what it is. I mean, True Grit is what it is. It's an amazing, masterful novel in which, to your question earlier about writing in the voice of a woman, here's Portis, able to write from this old woman's point of view, looking back on her 14-year-old self. It's an amazing feat. And I haven't really seen it done elsewhere except for in Robert Geip's Trampoline, which is also in my stack, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. But there were just so many things to be taught by with Portis. People may find fault in some of his portrayals of the Yucatan in this book, but it's a pretty amazing book with kind of little flares of even what we would call crime fiction in it, and that's something I'm very interested in, because I want to write novels that don't just enlighten and educate and have that sonorous sound, but that people want to read and that they enjoy reading for, frankly, the plot, for what happens, and some mystery.
Every time this comes up, the balance between, that like enlightenment or education and like actually enjoying the story, it just reminds me of the scene from Deadwood, because I love the language in Deadwood. It's ridiculous, but I've remembered so many points of dialogue from that. But the one that sticks out the most is when E.B. Farnham is talking to Al Swearingen, and Al Swearingen stops him. He's like, advance the subject, E.B., or E.B., or shut the fuck up. And I've never heard someone say that, advance the subject.
That is perfect.
But it's those turns of phrases. But that's what I feel like good writers can do, is you can have the enlightenment, the education, the empathy, but if you can't advance the subject with some sort of intrigue and force, then you're kind of lost. And I felt like that's where Cinder Bottom really got me with your writing, as I was like constantly wanting to go further. I mean, I read it in like 2 days. It's a brick of a book, it's like, and I just was like, okay, let's keep going. So I can see how
con, that was, I don't really know how to write plot, I've realized. So I'm like, well, I'll try the long con to guide my way. And I appreciate you saying that. Yeah. But dialogue, as you brought up, what was it? Advance the subject, E.B. Yeah. I mean, dialogue, I think, is one of the biggest things I take from Portis.
Yeah.
And I think people even see it in the Coen brothers adaptation. I mean, so much of the dialogue is word for word from Matty Ross. But, in something like Gringos, it's just like, even something as small as this from page 106, well, they're nice handkerchiefs. That's one line of dialogue. And then the answer to that one from the other character is, nothing fancy, but you can't beat long staple cotton for absorbency and smooth finish. Yeah, to just have the nerve to put that in the mouths of your characters is so freeing.
I love when people take those liberties, because it's your book,
right. That's right.
Like, be a little bit indulgent with this stuff, because that's what's memorable. And it's hard. Yes, the whole story's memorable, but it's those moments that make you love a book.
Exactly. They're so joyful. They make you feel such possibility.
Like, I remember talking with Julian Davis, who's mostly a painter, but he wrote a novel about the housing crisis in Asheville in 2008, where this guy rents out his house to this like really weird cast of characters. And anyways, one point of dialogue where he's talking about, I think maybe the Schiffer robe or something, and people's clothes, and one of the weirdest characters in the book just remarks, people were tiny back in those days. And like, there's just so many of those like little moments where I'm like, okay, I just love it. But yeah, I'm glad you brought in Charles, because I think it was Elizabeth Gonzalez James picked Dog of the South.
Oh, okay.
So it's the second Charles Portis book, and I'm glad you brought that one in there, because he's worth the read.
Oh, for sure. for sure. I feel like I've learned so much from his voice in a very, very different way than our first two writers we talked about.
What do you got for number 4?
Well, I don't know what order to go in here, but maybe I should jump to a more contemporary Appalachian voice that I've already alluded to through the amazing feat, and that is Robert Gipe's Trampoline. When I read this, and as you can see, I got it in the advanced review, uncorrected proof form.
Heck yeah.
I was lucky enough to do that. I just couldn't believe Don Jules' voice and how real it was. And, there are plenty of incredible books coming out of Appalachia in the last 10, 20, forever, really. But, if I just focus on the last decade or so. But I think what sets this one apart is a lack of distance from the people that are portrayed. They are so real, and her voice is so real. And someone like Uncle Hubert is just so real. And I immediately recognized a kinship before I even got to know Robert, which happened at Heinemann, of course. And
everybody meets everybody at Heinemann, man. That's the place to be.
We've been friends ever since. But even before I knew him, I read this, and I just, I just couldn't get over. Not just the dialogue, as we talked about with Portis, but just his ability to capture a people and a place in such a raw and real way without any sort of overarching agenda. So if a lot of people say, well, it's a book about mountaintop removal, it is, but of course you don't feel that when you're reading it. You're not aware, like, I'm reading a book about mountaintop removal. I'm reading a book about drug addiction. It just feels like you've been dropped in and you're just stunned and looking around and listening, and you really don't have to do much else.
It's interesting. This is now Mandy Fugit-Scheffel at Red Spotted Newt.
I just met her at Heinemann this last summer. She's wonderful.
Talk about the neighborhood hope spot.
Yeah.
Heinemann. I mean, everybody that I love has gone there, it seems like. But also Meredith McCarroll.
Yes.
This is now the third person that's picked this book.
Really?
Because of that, immediate identification of the realness and the closeness to the characters, and that they felt like they were both seen through this story, but they're related to this, at that micro level. And also the performative nature of this book, it could be a performance. I heard him read at City Lights, my third week on the job was App Studies Conference. And him reading from this book, it's truly, it almost feels like it was meant to read.
Oh, yes.
Out loud. And so it's just again, we were talking about is being able to bring people into a place, but it's not like a preachy thing, it's just, this is a story about these people. And even as someone outside of Appalachia most of my life, I can really appreciate this. But it's cool that he keeps getting brought up, and it's important because Robert Gipe deserves to be way more known than he is outside of Appalachia.
He sure does. And in the end, as I said, it's just stunning, and all you can say, and those who have read it will know, is just, ain't that something? Ain't that something? I mean, and so I can never stop giving it praise.
Heck yeah.
And then my last two, if you want me to keep moving along.
Sure.
These probably come from my teaching days and ones that I would return to again and again for little Xeroxed handouts that I would give students. And again, they're just finds that I happened to pick up. This one I got off a bookshelf at Empire Books in Huntington, West Virginia, my hometown. And it was used, and it's Roadside Dog by Czesław Miłosz, if I'm saying his name correctly, which I'm probably not. And as you can see, lots of dog ears, lots of Post-its. And I suppose you would call them prose poems. They're just little chunks, so they've obviously influenced my own style. But they're just little things, like one will be called In the Place of the Creator, another one, Meanwhile, and Make Believe, Warmth. And he just kind of goes off on little tangents. The novel. I always, for my MFA students who are interested in writing novels, I would always have them read this short 4-line thing. And it speaks to our point a moment ago with your line of dialogue about moving on, getting to it. What's going to happen?
Can you read that?
Sure. The novel should interest, thrill, and move us. If it does not, it lacks the traits of a true novel. By nature sentimental and melodramatic, it resembles a fairy tale. This has often been forgotten from the moment the novel was charged with a multitude of duties.
Whoa.
It's kind of what we just said about Geip's novel.
Yeah.
It's not charged with a multitude of duties.
Mm-mm.
It's charged with stunning and delighting and moving the reader, cleaning their clock, if you will. Just boom, like a fairy tale.
But yeah, and you have to find that like ability to say, I'm not bound to these duties.
Right.
Yeah, which is hard. And I think that's why a lot of novels get caught up.
I know.
I mean, especially contemporary novels right now. I mean, I feel like there has to be a fight for the soul of the novel at this point. Some of them are dreadful, and they're getting so much acclaim. And I'm not one speaking on ill of anybody. I praise what I love. I do not talk down on the things I despise. But there are a lot of books I despise, and it's because it's like, again, advance the subject, give me something, light my soul. I don't give a shit what your whole point is. Like, you can just tell there's too much that they feel beholden. Like, this novel has to do this, and I'm like, no. Well, I'm going to have to take a picture of that, of what the novel's supposed to do, to thrill.
Well, what you're saying, and I'm from the same school, praise what I love, don't down talk anything, but to kind of pick up on what you're saying, sometimes I wonder with reviewers and blurbers, I'm like, did you really read the whole thing? Or,
I hear you, because sometimes I'm like, what do you...
Because it takes so long, and it wasn't really going anywhere.
And I feel like it's just like a chummy system, you know what I mean? Like, everybody just pats themselves on the back and each other for things that like aren't even really moving the needle. And again, that's why God bless you, Otis Spunkmeyer. I'm telling you, man, it's going to light you up. It's going to light you up.
And that's what we're looking for, as we talked about earlier, with the light in the darkness. I'm ready to be lit up by a novel. So yeah, my last one, and I hated not to do, so it's always Eduardo Galeano. Don't know much about Uruguay personally, but I found, and I went through my Gabriel Garcia Marquez phase in graduate school. Love the guy. But for me, it's Galeano. And it's not, it's mainly because of this book, Mirrors, which this subtitle is Stories of Almost Everyone, which again are more small chunks, things like Forbidden to Laugh, a father who never laughs. But they literally are stories of almost everyone from every place throughout time. And he was just such a genius. Windows on the World is what I used most in teaching. But more recently, I've gone back and read Mirrors. And I just can't get over the depth and breadth of his knowledge of religions, for one thing, throughout the world, which obviously, in the way we talked about Lucille Clifton guiding us in times of socio-political strife, what we see happening with religion at home and abroad is mind-boggling at this point, and you don't really know where to turn. And so his sheer knowledge on all religions of the world, maybe not sheer knowledge on all religions, but it's just, it's overwhelming, but at the same time, it's kind of affirming too, because you read a passage called Baghdad, and you think about the Holy Land and how old these places are. You read about the Palestinians in here, and you learn so much more to give you context. And you just basically learn how religion has constantly been used for death and murder and separation of folks and exile. And instead of turning you against humans, it somehow does the opposite. So, for instance, there's a whole section, these titles are going to sound terrible when I say them aloud, but that's his whole point. To be clear, he's a very enlightened he was a very enlightened worldly man.
Yeah.
The devil is Muslim. The devil is Jewish. The devil is black. The devil is female. The devil is poor. The devil is foreign. The devil is homosexual. The devil is gypsy. And so each of those in succession gives you an account of how throughout time this group has been scapegoated and turned into the devil for this reason by this people in this place. And
I gotta read this. I've never heard of this at all.
It is something else. And obviously it's what we see happening in our country right now. Whether it's to do with gender and identity, whether it's to do with sexuality, whether it's to do with where you're from in terms of if you're an immigrant or if you're poor. All of these things they're attempting to criminalize them. And so I just, again, like you talked about earlier, finding community, I'm able to still do it through books, through voices of, in almost every case here, of writers who are no longer with us, who knew so much that I never knew until I'm almost at midlife here. I'm at midlife, and I'm just now learning. And so...
it's like constant revelation and discovery.
Right.
The more you read.
Right.
I think the better you can live. And you can see these things and understand that they're wrong. I mean, like, yeah, the criminalization, you can make anybody out to be a devil.
Right.
And it almost seems like that is the trick of religion.
Exactly.
Let's just find these groups to demonize, and then we have a unified enemy.
Right.
And as long as you use the language of devil or evil, your whole congregation will buy it.
That's right.
And this is where that's why I struggled with Catholicism in the ways, even in a world religions class in high school, which they had to teach, but there wasn't a world religions class because it wasn't meant to appreciate the diversity of religion. It was meant to exalt Catholicism over everything else.
Right.
And, this was post 9/11, well, not a few years after. And so you could just like feel the judgment and the separation. I'm like, isn't this the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing?
Right.
It's not a crime to be poor.
No.
It's not a crime to be transgender. It's not a crime
Right.
to be any of these things, but you can make it so. And God said it.
Right.
Even if the Bible didn't.
Right. Even if it said the opposite. And somehow it becomes... So here's, to your point about... I'll just read this one little section from The Devil is Poor. Hunger, which kills silently, kills the silent. Experts speak for them. Poorologists who tell us what the poor do not work at, what they do not eat, what they do not weigh, what height they do not reach, what they do not have, what they do not think, what parties they do not vote for, what they do not believe in. The only question unanswered is why poor people are poor. Could it be because we are fed by their hunger and clothed by their nakedness? And you read a question like that and you're like, aha, it's basically everything you just said.
That stops you dead in your tracks.
It does. So
I mean, gosh, I got to get that. Holy smokes. That is incredible.
I can't claim to know all of Galeano's work. He had so many books, but...
And you said he's from where?
Uruguay.
I mean, wow, that's incredible. I was hoping before we end that you could pick a Louise McNeil poem for you to read, because I selfishly love hearing people read poems that I love, and clearly this is dear to your heart, and I think would be a good way to end, because we need these words.
We do. And so I'll grab Hill Daughter, which
They're
of
eternal.
course is all... This is something I learned from my old man, no respect for books.
Just
dog ear and mark them up. And I don't know how he came to have that practice, but I started it young, and I'm just not good at keeping them clean.
Yeah, they're meant to be. They're meant to be worn and used.
Yes, I agree. That's how you treat yours?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes, though, I do have, like, multiple copies. Like, if I want one to be pristine, like, on a shelf or something, and then another one that's just, like, destroyed.
Yes. You brought up Hill Daughter earlier, which, of course, another West Virginia writer, Maggie Anderson, was able to put this together. I've seen her read a couple of times. She has a great poem, Maggie Anderson, called Spitting in the Leaves, if you've never read it. It's a great poem. But I'm so happy with the way she put this together and the way she organized it, not chronologically. But you brought up Elaine reading about the New River earlier, and I wonder... There are so many that could be about, that she's able to touch the prehistoric when writing about the New River, which is the great irony, right? So it could have been the poem The River, which is beautiful enough, but adjacent to that page is a poem called Burying Field, which is really short, but I think in light of our conversation, I'll go with that one. I'll let the listener decide what it says about land, like you've talked about, and air and water and the idea of ownership. Burying Field. Dwarf pine and yellow moonshine grass thrive on this dry, rejected land. Hawkweed and bitter sassafras root clutch their living from its sand. Black ground was fenced for men to till. The dead of Gully own this hill. Those last two lines I used as the epigraph, as I said, for my second novel. And
gosh.
Because you can just think about them all the livelong day and never quite get there. What we've done, and then how we go back to it when we die and we get buried in it. It's mind-boggling.
It gets me every time, man.